Howdy all, in today's video we're going to check out how we can color grade in the style of Wes Anderson. For those of you who are not familiar with Wes Anderson's films and his cinematographic style, let me show you the look that we're trying to replicate. So movies like The Grand Budapest Hotel, Isle of Dogs, Moonrise Kingdom, and Fantastic Mr. Fox are just some of the greatest films, and not only of Wes Anderson, but from the entire world of film in general. His films are characterized by a very specific way of storytelling, but above all, a highly refined and almost iconic style. Now, the style is characterized by static camera angles and a very sort of artful central compositions. In addition to these, Anderson's films are also unique with their colors, and this is the look that we're going to try to replicate. But a big question is going to be, which movie? Because all of his movies have a very specific color palette, but mainly a definitive color for that particular film. Now, there's a lot to choose from, and I'm going to choose some of the most distinctive ones, or at least the ones we think that are distinctive. Films like Asteroid City, Moonrise Kingdom, and The Grand Budapest Hotel. We'll start with Asteroid City. Now, besides choosing a photo that ideally has central composition, you'll also need to choose what's known as a reference image. And we use reference images to make adjustments so they're as close as possible to the sample. It's good to have a reference image so that you can put these two images side by side and see what needs to be adjusted. It's also helpful to choose a reference image that has similar colors to the photo that you're applying the adjustments to, but it's not necessary. Having a similar photo is going to make it easier to compare them. Now let's move on to the editing. All right, let's start with exposure and focus on contrast. Asteroid City contrast is pretty low, so I'm going to lower the contrast for my photo. But now the shadows have faded quite a bit, so I'm going to restore some of that contrast by decreasing blacks. And that should be enough for exposure for now. Next, I'm going to start working with colors. First, I'm going to adjust the white balance. The photo is a bit cool, so I'm going to add warmer tones. And since Asteroid City's color palette is green, I'm going to move tint closer to green. Next, let's compare our photo to the reference image just to see if we've gotten any closer with adjustments to exposure and white balance and see if we've began to capture that look. Now, the exposure is starting to look similar, but we have some catching up to do when it comes to the color. Now, the colors in our sample are much more vibrant. So first, I'm going to increase vibrance significantly to bring out the dominant colors in the photo, and then I'm going to compare the two again. All right, so we're getting there slowly but surely, but we still need to play around with the colors, and especially for the sky. For Asteroid City, it's more or less a bright turquoise. So in color shift, I'm going to choose blue, and then with the mask enabled, I'm going to select which shades are affected. I'm careful not to include the trees on the left side of the photo, and once my selection is complete, I'll disable the mask and move hue toward green. Increase saturation and decrease luminance to make the color pop a bit more. Once again, I'm going to check the reference image. All right, so it's getting there, but I can see that the Wes Anderson sky is still a bit greener. When I look at the sample, I can see it has a yellow greenish tint, and especially in the midtones. The tone curve can help there. I'm going to choose green and add green to the midtones. Now I can see it's a bit blue and not so close to the yellowish greenish tint that I want. So I'm going to select blue and decrease it for the midtones. This adds yellow, and I'm going to compare the two images again. Now we can see that we have a yellowish greenish tint, but the whole image isn't as orange or yellow as the sample. So I'm going to add some yellow orange to the master's color wheel in split toning and do a comparison once again. So as you can see, we're getting really close, but there's still a few things that just aren't quite right, especially the reds, oranges, and yellows. So I'm going to go to color shift and start off with orange. I'm going to increase saturation and luminance. And next, I'm going to move on to yellow. First, I'm going to slightly increase saturation to make the yellows pop. Then I'm going to compare it to the reference image again. So when I compare similar colors like this cliff and the main character's shirt, I can see that the yellows are slightly green. So super carefully, I'm going to move hue toward green. Then when I switch to red, I'm going to increase saturation quite a bit and then move it just a tiny bit towards green and yellow so that the red is more orange than currently it is purple. Now I'm being extremely careful not to overdo it. So let's compare the two again. So we're getting really close, but since we keep adding green, there's just too much of it, and especially in the shadows. I'm gonna go back to tone curve and play around a bit more to remove the green from the shadows. I'm gonna move the bottom point away from the corner and gradually remove green from the shadows. Since this is gonna affect the rest of the curve, I'm gonna check my sample and tweak the middle point. Now one last check. And I think we're quite done. Now see how the photo looked before and now after editing. All right, next up is gonna be Moonrise Kingdom, and this film is famous for its sort of yellow palette. So let's see if we can copy and duplicate that. All right, so after choosing a reference image, we can again start with exposure. The photo is quite dark compared to the reference image, so I'm gonna increase exposure and slightly reduce contrast and then reduce lights so that the sky between the trees is not completely overexposed. I'm gonna brighten up the shadows a bit and then use blacks to bring some contrast back in. After comparing, I think the exposure is good, so let's move on to colors. Now, as I mentioned, Moonrise Kingdom features a distinctive yellow color palette, so I'm gonna move temperature much more towards yellow. And after comparing them again, I can see that it can be even a bit more yellow, so I'm gonna carefully move the temperature even more towards yellow. Let's compare again. All right, I think we've nailed the level of yellow that we want, but when I compare the yellows, say for the moss and the grass with the Boy Scout scarves, I can see that my photo is turning purple. So I'm gonna carefully shift hue toward green. And as I compare them again, we can see that we're getting quite a bit of green, especially in the shadows. So I'm gonna use the tone curve to remove some of the green from the shadows, and in the midtones, there's just a bit too much blue, or rather, not really enough yellow. So I'm gonna switch to blue and decrease it for the midtones. All right, and now I've got a lot of reds in the highlights. So as you can see in the sky between the trees. Now I'm gonna choose red and put one point in the middle and reduce the red for the top point. Now I'm not too worried about it right now because I'm going to get the specific color of the sky later. Now again, I'm gonna compare my photo with the reference image just to see what it looks like this time. And it seems like it's time to address the colors, especially green. So using color shift, I'm gonna choose a green with more blue tones and move it towards yellow. It's also quite saturated and bright, so I'm gonna lower both settings. The yellows are also too green, so I'm gonna select it to adjust everything that is yellow. And since the photo is warm, there's yellow almost everywhere. I can even select the yellow trees in the background. Then I'm gonna shift it towards yellow and orange. I'm also gonna lower its luminance and saturation to match the reference image. And let's compare them again. All right, so we're at this step now. Next up, I'm gonna need to adjust the sky because that color just doesn't match what we want. In fact, the highlights aren't even yellow enough. So I'm gonna add a yellow-green tint to the lights in split toning, just like the sky in the reference image. Let's compare them again. Okay, now we can see it's just a little bit too green, so I'm gonna go back to split toning and move the lights a little more towards orange and then compare it again. It's getting really close, but we still gotta move the master color wheel a tad closer to yellow. Almost there. Let's just do some finishing touches. The photo still has a lot of contrast compared to the reference image, so I'm gonna slightly decrease contrast. And upon further comparison, we can see that the entire photo is turning purple. So for white balance, I'm gonna shift tint towards green again. And we're basically done, but there's one more thing. Since Moonrise Kingdom was shot on film, I'm going to add some grain and halation just to make them even more similar and add that extra charm. All right, so the last film we're gonna try to replicate from Wes Anderson is the Grand Budapest Hotel, which features a more sort of pinkish tones and sort of bluish tones for the shadows. So let's see if we can copy that. All right, we're gonna breeze through the steps this time. The concept is exactly the same, and we're just gonna change the colors that we want so that the photo matches our reference image and the film's theme in general. So let's start with exposure to globally brighten the photo. And this time I'm gonna add contrast because the Grand Budapest Hotel is very high contrast. The photo is too cool, so I'm gonna add some warm yellows under white balance, and I'm gonna move tint far towards purple to get that pinkish tint that we're after. Now after comparing, I can see that there's a lot of orange in the photo, which is more yellow than red. So I'm gonna choose orange in color shift and expand the affected color and then move it all towards purple. The red is a bit too loud, so I'm gonna decrease saturation for that level. Now this adjustment has heavily affected my skin tones, which are now very pale. So using red under color shift, I make my selection as carefully as possible. Other parts of the photo are also now selected, which I could solve using local adjustments, but I'm not going to get into that today. But you definitely can if you want to. But anyway, for my selection, I'm gonna increase saturation and move the color slightly towards orange so it matches the sample. The orange is still too orange, so under Shift Primary Colors, I'm gonna move the red a bit towards purple and increase saturation. Next, I like to emphasize not only that pink tint, but also the blue shadows we talked about. So under Split Toning, I move lights towards purple and shadows towards blue, or rather a sort of turquoise, because due to the white balance adjustments, the blues actually are gonna seem too purple. Since the reference image is more orange overall compared to our photo, we can shift the point for master toward yellow again, mixed with the purple, so it'll look actually redder. Yep, now it's looking good. Only the photo seems to have more contrast than I'd like, so I'm gonna go back to exposure and set contrast back to 0. Now it looks oversaturated to me, so I'm gonna decrease saturation, but add vibrance just to emphasize the dominant colors. And since we're kind of perfectionists here, the photo still looks a tad green, so let's move tint under white balance a little more towards purple. Okay, and this time, I'm done. No, really, we're done. All right, so now when somebody looks at your photograph, they might say, hey, that looks like a Wes Anderson photo. And you'll say, yeah, it does. I hope this was an interesting topic for you guys. If there's something similar in this sort of aspect you guys like to go through again in the future, please feel free to let us know in the comments below. Otherwise, give us a thumbs up. Don't forget to hit that subscribe bell so you never miss another video like this one. And we look forward to seeing you in the next one. Take care, see you later. Ciao.